Hello, everyone. I'm Punar Givanch, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of chatting with Jennifer Posner. Jennifer is a director of programs at the University of Miami's Climate Resilience Institute. In this role, she supports the creation of strategies and collaborations to enhance University of Miami's interdisciplinary, problem-driven research and education, to promote Miami as a leader in delivering solutions to climate change. Jennifer has extensive experience as an urban planner, shaping physical planning and policy initiatives that enhance neighborhood livability and equitable access. Previously, she spent nearly a decade with the New York City Department of City Planning, where she led the agency's policy and planning work for several large-scale initiatives in Brooklyn and helped to execute the agency's strategic planning vision. Enjoy our conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Jennifer Posner. Jennifer is the director of programs at University of Miami Climate Resilience Institute. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks
Great
for
to be
making
here.
the time. Yeah,
Of
so this
course.
is obviously like this space is something that we're very, very interested in. So I'm really curious where the conversation is going to take us today. But first, maybe let's start with hearing about your background a little bit and how you came to where you are today.
Sure. So yeah, I grew up in the suburbs of DC, and truly suburban, as I kind of knew then this was not what I aspired to for myself. I felt very marooned, and probably lazy. Like I think when I think about getting to the nearest commercial center, it was probably only like a mile and a half, but it felt miles away. And so, I was definitely on, the day I turned 16, needed my license, the whole like suburban dream, I guess. But I think being in DC, my dad worked for the federal government, and he was, very sort of policy wonky person. So I think that somehow trickled into my psyche. And when I was trying to, kind of think of like, what do I want to be when I grow up? And I took a few years after college, and kind of said, you know what, I think I love kids. I love education. Maybe I want to go back to school and learn about how to, help kind of solve problems through education, which felt like a very kind of direct intervention. And then the more I thought about it and the more I learned as I was investigating this, I kind of learned about urban planning. It was not something that I had ever really heard of before. It was not, you know, I took some architecture classes in college, but more almost like an art history perspective.
Mm.
But I was really always kind of drawn to cities, to like how people functioned. I was a very useful sociology and French double major in college, which is, the dream for finding a job. um, but the sociologist in me, I think, recognized, once I heard about urban planning, this may be a better fit for me than teaching, because what it really felt like to me was that this was a way to make progress in people's lives through the livability of their communities. And I am sort of, you know, I think I'm not, if you, well, you can see, I'm not a super organized person in my home, but in my kind of like head and my work life and maybe my dream life, I'm very detail oriented. And so I think that learning more about the design elements, the creativity of that, and how kind of these pieces fit together or don't fit together, and how they influence how people engage and really thrive. When I think back about my suburban upbringing, I mean, it was perfectly healthy, happy, fine. But I realize now that the kind of context that I lived in, and that I choose to live in now, are really influential, more so than I ever would have thought. And that's probably just kind of like the planner lens, which I feel fortunate to have now. But so long story, I went to urban to get a master's in urban planning at the University of Pennsylvania. And it was, it was really a transformative experience. It was like happy to stay up all night to work on this and to kind of like dig into these issues. And Philadelphia was a really interesting sort of lab to do this in. I mean, it has the history. Um, Obviously, I had the very interesting um, really interesting, strange kind of side job of working with Ed Bacon, who is a historically is kind of the father of urban planning in Philadelphia, certainly, but I mean even bigger. I think as an urban designer, he's often kind of he was very powerful and influential. And he really, I mean, it also helps with 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, with that game is very important. Um, but so I felt like I had my coursework, I was really influenced, and I had amazing professors. And I had the work with Ed. He was working on sort of his final, he was trying to work on an update to his Design of Cities book. And so he sadly passed away, but he was, I think when I was working with him, he was 97. I mean, he was there every day, just really sharp and ready to go. But and I think it's what's interesting also was that I had this juxtaposition of being in planning school and kind of learning about the way that cities had been designed and the way we think of them, now 50, 60 years later. There's some things that I wouldn't call them mistakes, but I think there were choices that were made that are not as um, maybe as functional as the original designers had intended. And so I think that's where a lot of cities find themselves. And this was really interesting because Ed was very involved in a lot of the planning of Center City, Philadelphia. There were a lot of sort of sunken plazas, things that we know now are unfortunately become, just sort of hidden corners, dark, not as engaging and inviting for people. I had really, really great connections to my professors there. I felt really fortunate about that. And to this day, I'm in touch. We just had a conference here in Miami, and the former director of my program at Penn, I invited her to come and speak on a panel, and it was just very, you know, full circle and really nice to still have those connections. And this, the planning world is pretty small, and so it's and active. I mean, it's a great community. So I left school. I left Penn with my master's and also with my future husband, who was also in the program. And I met there, and then he was moving, he needed to move to New York. He wanted to go to business school, just needed more schooling. So I decided to move with him. I was never one of these people who wanted to move to New York. I mean, I think there are people who are like
Yeah.
born to live in New York, and it's like on the bucket list. I didn't have that feeling. I had lived in San Francisco before Philadelphia. I really thought that's where I want to go back to. And so, but I was with this person, and I said, okay, I'll go to, we'll go for grad school. And of course, it becomes very intoxicating. And I think especially for the work that we were looking to do, I mean, I think it's unparalleled in a lot of ways. It's spoiling in a lot of ways. It also, I find it makes people a little bit insufferable when they're in other cities talking about it and
Oh my
comparing it. And
God.
I catch myself sometimes. I've been away from the city for 12 years now, so it's like it's not.
You recovered.
Um,
Maybe you recovered.
and I miss it. I mean, I really do. Like, there is so much about it, and that's really what I wanted to talk about is the kind of the walkability, because
Yeah.
um, it's something that we take for granted there, and take for granted slash almost depending on the weather, hate. Right? I mean, it's like you are. you have to get your groceries home. I mean, I lived there pre sort of grocery delivery,
Yeah, yeah.
so I think that's probably changed. But it's just there's a lot more thought about living in New York. You have to be, or any probably big city. You have to be very practical and pragmatic about choices you make, about the bag that you carry that day. Will it take can you carry your groceries home with it? The shoes that you're wearing. I mean, and there is sort of this shared. Feeling among people who made the choice to live like that, that you are kind of you're
That's a
you're
great
a
summary.
warrior.
Yeah.
It's the normal things of living are that much more challenging there. And so it was, and I think as a planner, part of what, so anyway, let me go back to that. I left Philadelphia, went to New York, through a wonderful connection of my professor at Penn. I got a job working for the New York City Department of City Planning, as the special assistant to the chair of the department, who at that time was Amanda Burden. And Amanda was a real um, dynamo, in terms of, I mean, in terms of everything. I mean, she was a tireless, truly, like I've never, one of these people that I keep encountering who are just seem to run on zero sleep and like maybe a Diet Coke. And she was unstoppable. She was tenacious. I learned in the 2 years I worked directly for her, I learned an unbelievable amount. And it was, a lot of it was trial by fire. Um, it was working with her on all sorts of things, going with her to speaking engagements, going to the commission meetings and sort of seeing what was happening there. This was a time, with big projects, big bold visions of Mayor Bloomberg's administration. So I was there for Hudson Yards, going through for Greenpoint and Williamsburg, the Olympics bid. I mean, there were so many. It was very exciting. I mean, it was, and I didn't, I appreciated it, but I think now when I look back on it, at the time sometimes it was like, this is hard.
Yeah,
Some
yeah,
of
of course. Yeah.
this is really hard, but it was, I think it was the best training I could have hoped for. And the best connections and the best, opportunities. And, I spent 10 years there. After I worked for her, I moved over to the Brooklyn office of city planning because I wanted to do some kind of real physical planning and design. So I helped head up our work at that time on the Gowanus Canal zoning, which
Yeah.
that was an iteration many years ago. That was We were working on that for probably 5 years when the federal government designated the canal a Superfund site.
Mm.
And it turns out having a Superfund in an area is pretty stifling to making changes and inviting the idea of residential development. Our premise had been that if the canal continues to stay occupied by these vacant buildings, a few warehouses and industrial, that there are like no eyes on the street. So it's like people were dumping in there. I mean, it was just, there's a lot of history and lore. And
Yeah.
so I do, now I hear and see what's happening there, after the cleanup. And that was the right thing to do, obviously. But it was, that was a really, um, challenging process, and I mean, that was my like real foray into community engagement and community planning. And it was just incredibly committed people, on both sides of the idea. I mean, there were people who were very pro development and there were people who were very anti, and understandably. I mean, this is, kind of the story of anywhere that's sort of gaining popularity, but had been first colonized. And that's not the word. First identified by artists and people who are like creative and found these wonderful spaces to work in, and then are this threat of gentrification is always kind of looming. So there, that was a, it was all of the good and the bad and the hard and the challenging and the rewarding. And I came away with a real understanding of how the city works and also where it doesn't work, and where these processes um, do kind of leave people behind, and thinking about how we bring people along on these journeys without making them amateur urban planners. I mean, I think
Right.
I always feel like there's a real distinction where when you're asking for engagement and you want people to get involved, but I think I think I can't think of what the corollary would be for me. I mean, it's kind of like if I go to a doctor, like I don't want to know how to stitch my arm up,
Yeah.
but I trust you, and I'm not asking people to trust me because I'm a planner and I work with we're with the city.
Yeah.
But I do think like there's these processes. I think there's so much that's happened in engagement and thinking about how we engage communities in a thoughtful and meaningful way, and that it shouldn't mean that you have to like read the entire zoning code, that it should really be about like your perception of lived experience and what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
So it was great for that. And then we moved to Miami, um, which is where my husband grew up. He's the only person until, I mean, now, but to that point, the only person I'd ever met who was from Miami. I had never been to Miami before I met him. And it was when we would come and visit his family, it was, it's like being on vacation. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it was like, the idea of wearing flip-flops in January was always like very intoxicating. Like, what are we doing? This is amazing.
Yeah.
And then we were greeted with the opportunity to move here. He got a job doing economic development for Miami-Dade County, which is what he'd been doing in New York. And so we moved, and we've been here since. He's moved on to other jobs, and I joined the University of Miami, working. I was kind of working on consulting and some writing for a couple of years when we first moved here because my kids were very little, and then I started working at UM. I worked in an office called the Office of Civic and Community Engagement, which is a really kind of unique office in universities, but at UM, it's really how can UM sort of be a good neighbor and bring the thought leadership from the university to communities, around Miami. And the focus was and is still really around affordable housing. That was kind of the area where they felt that they could contribute the most kind of knowledge and information. And they've kind of gotten into resilience over time because those issues are inextricable. And so we created a number of engagement and advocacy tools, so mapping, policy toolkits, and it was a really terrific place for me to land. Um, I missed like kind of the planning, getting into the weeds on that, but I actually really appreciated this opportunity to really think more. When you're working for the city, it's like there are so many protocols that are required that you go through, the ULURP process, which is very, dogmatic and has milestones. And then this was more, it was kind of more iterative, working on what
Yeah.
the issues were that were coming up. And it was really, and still is very meaningful work. And I got really much more kind of engaged with the community organizations here, and I think that really made me feel um, home in Miami. I think it took me a little while to get used to this place. It's very different. Um,
Very. Yeah.
I mean, it is really, I probably say that every day still, 12 years later. Um, but the long story, and so then in the last about a year and a half ago, I joined the University of Miami created a resilience institute, and the intention was to recognizing that there's so much innovation and work being done at UM, around the university and all of our colleges and schools. Um, trying to be really intentional and thoughtful about how we bring that work together, and kind of the synergies that are there, and the connections and relationships that may not otherwise have been found, because it's a university is inherently siloed, inherently kind of a solo mission for a lot of people. The process of getting tenure, and there is an element of it that can be very kind of singular,
Yeah.
so I think there was a real appetite for this and a real interest across the board. My boss, the director of our center, Michael Berkowitz, was the executive director of 100 Resilient Cities, which was Rockefeller Foundation's big resilience initiative, and really put, I think, resilience on the map. Kind of gave life to that term, and
Yeah.
all that means, that it's not just climate, it's social, it's economic, and kind of, I think, introduced that into the lexicon, and introduce the role of resilience in local government. I mean, I think that was sort of the big the big thing that they did, that's a remaining legacy, is that they seated chief resilience officers in governments in 100 cities around the world, and obviously there are many more now than there were then, and so that has been this next iteration of my career, and kind of working more explicitly with resilience, has felt like a very natural progression. It feels like it's, when I went to planning school, it was not really
Yeah.
part of the deal. We talked about LEED, you would get LEED
Yeah. Yeah.
certified,
Yeah.
and that was sustainability. That was really kind of on a building level. But the kind of things we're talking about are actually, it feels very full circle to me, because it is really what I wanted to go to planning school for, which was trying to make communities feel safe and livable, and joyful for people. And I think that the resilience work that we're trying to do, is all those things. If you're in a city, if you're in a suburb, it applies to everybody everywhere. It is a very universal need, and it's a great. I feel very, very happy and lucky to be able to do what I'm doing now.
I love that your entire journey kind of I was thinking the same thing when you said it. It's like the where you should have landed, like after all experience, seeing all these different cities and also going through these like diverse processes and like in different neighborhoods within New York City. But to your point, also like really understanding the civic like community engagement piece of it all, because I think and this is not even just United States, right? At least in the United States, we're seeing more and more interest or attention to community engagement. Whether or not that's done effectively or poorly, that's a separate conversation. But sometimes like we were looking into like we were involved in a project 2 years ago in Mumbai who set the goal to be net zero by 2050. And when
Mhm.
we were involved in the project, it was already like a year into it. And, we asked, did you start looping in people from informal settlements as it's like 50% of the
Right,
population in the city? And they hadn't, right? So you're kind of thinking, you have this goal, how do you expect to reach the goal without zero engagement, right? And at that point, I feel like I also have so much aha moments in like projects where I'm like, oh, wait, because when we say engagement, like, because historically what has been done, right? Like we go into communities, ask a bunch of questions, then we go back to our
right,
black box and do what we need to do. And maybe in the final iteration of everything, we go out and say, like, this is what we're planning to do. And everybody was like, that's not what we're talking about, right? So
right,
that's not what we mean by engagement, right? So like how do we like shape up? And to your point earlier too, we're not telling people to be the doctor. We just need
right,
to be able to synthesize what we're hearing effectively. So therefore, how should we design the process of doing that? And then who are the players to be synthesizing that? You were talking about your education in sociology, where I always advocate, like in every project, we need like a sociologist, historian, and a psychologist. So I think you're like the perfect package. Um, and I think what also to your point around resiliency and the terminology and what it means and how it differs from sustainability. I feel like I don't know when, but like obviously we do also do a very good job in making like a big statement and translating it into a product. Like I think sustainability became like a getting a LEED certification for your building, and it's
Right.
way more than that. But I started to think more and more, okay, like for things to sustain, it needs to work for like the planet and the people, right? So then being resilient could actually help you reach the goal, right? So it's like to me, it
Right.
started to be, oh, like it's more weaved into the process. Like there's so much around resiliency. To your point earlier, like we can't necessarily think about these things in silos, right? There's so many factors about a city, about the communities living there that just everything needs to come together and all the research around it. And it is a highly complex topic because there are many diverse stakeholders who typically need facilitation of the conversation and again synthesis of what's coming up
Right.
so that we can actually translate into meaningful things. Um, but because it's so complex, it's also so fulfilling. I guess like
Yes.
especially at an age of AI,
Yes.
like things are getting generated in 2 seconds. I'm like, okay, so
Oh,
like this is what I'm interested in now. Like if you're gonna sketch me an entire plan in 5 minutes, especially 2 years from now, maybe you won't even have issues with it. But like the multi-stakeholder management to realize things, not necessarily in, and we see it as co-design practitioner, we see this often too, right? Like when we mention co-design to sometimes even to designers, we see people getting territorial in a way where like
yeah.
the designers and you're kind of like, well, I'm not talking about a jam session on a software, right? We're talking about the process being
Right.
collaborative. And um, I think like it there with this like having like now technology leading us to outputs much faster, there is I think there is going to be much more need to zoom in onto the process and how we curate and conduct those processes. And I think resiliency in that space too I'm hoping gets even like more the attention than it needs, also because of where we are today in the world, right? And I like
Right.
obviously would love to hear your thoughts for context of Miami too, as we know, of course, with like the climate change. Also, what does that mean for rising sea levels, floods that are happening more frequently in the world, natural disasters in period happening more frequently in the world? Um, what are some of the things that you're seeing today? And you mentioned a few things around, again, of course, we talked about community engagement, whether or not that is done effectively. We talked about how sometimes, obviously bureaucracy can also slow things down, but sometimes it should. Maybe sometimes it doesn't or shouldn't.
Right.
So would love to get your thoughts on, considering where we're at today in the world, right? And you can
Yep.
speak to, Miami as a case study or other places too. Obviously, there should be more and more attention in this space for various reasons. What are you seeing as kind of the speed bumps, let's say, in having us kind of reach these resiliency goals or even raising awareness of the need. But to your point, I think that we're a bit far further down in that conversation compared to maybe 10 years ago. I'm sure there's still a lot that needs to be done, but would love to get your thoughts.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think things are definitely in a different place than they were from 10 years ago. I think uh, I was involved in my earlier in the Office of Civic and Community Engagement in an oral history project where we were talking, the focus of that was climate gentrification. And we were very, we said we want to understand what people in these communities that are the most threatened are thinking and feeling. And so we met with a group of young adults who were formerly homeless.
Mm.
And so we were talking to them about sort of their perceptions and the challenges, and then we asked specifically, what do you think about climate change? And I mean, they were so wonderful. Like it was a great. The conversations were so just just they gave us so much. I mean, it was really. But I think the most instructive thing that came from it was when we asked them. I'll never forget this. The one of the young ladies said, what do you think of climate change?" She said, "Oh yeah, I those those wildfires in California. Those are really scary." That was climate change to her because that is the lion on your back. And I think one of the harder things here is that living, where hurricanes, I think people have got hurricanes. People keep candles and water and all that stuff all year. That, we're very good at communicating that. I think the other elements of changing climate are slower and more insidious, and don't even register. And that was my takeaway from that, was like, oh my, we are nowhere near talking about climate gentrification here.
Right.
That's not where we are. Like our interception, with the place where we can intersect with this young woman is about the things that are happening here and that will happen in that education. So it was very enlightening that, for some people worrying about, you know, maybe historically, I don't know about moving forward, but for some people, having climate as their big worry has been a luxury in some ways. If you're somebody who's not sure where you're gonna like hang your hat that
Right.
night,
Right.
um, and Miami is a very, very divided city economically. I mean, we are, I think in the city of Miami, two-thirds of people are cost burdened, so meaning that they spend more than 50% of their monthly wages on housing and related costs. So we are the most, I mean, for a while, we've been the most expensive city for renters in the country. And that is a function of our high rent prices, but also really low wages. Like this city is predominantly a service industry. I mean, tourism is our big industry here. And so
Right.
when you have people earning hourly wages, and their kind of trajectory is limited, it really kind of creates this roadblock. And I would say so those are the challenges. On the upside of things in Miami, I have been so impressed and heartened and just like grateful to work with the nonprofit leaders that are here. I mean, there are really tremendous organizations that have led discussions about these issues, not just in Miami, but nationally. There's the Clio Institute, which works with young people around the state to make them climate advocates. And so they go every year, they take them to Tallahassee and kind of give them exposure to lobbying and talking about the bills. And, Florida is um, for some people, it's the who are
Yeah.
listening to this, there have been historically some legislative roadblocks to some of the climate and resilience related legislation that we'd like to see. But it doesn't stop this group. And I think that's what's really important is their messaging is you're not going to get this on try one. You're not going to,
Yeah.
but that you just you keep chipping away at it. And so I feel really lucky and confident with a lot of the community leaders, the nonprofit leaders. I feel like we have people who are thinking in the right way, who are using their platform and the kind of accessibility. Another big example I think that's been really successful here is a project called the Underline, which is sort of the inspiration name came from the High Line, I think. But we have an elevated. People may be surprised to know that Miami has public transit, mass transit in a metro. It is. It's limited. It's there. It's pretty limited, but in sort of the southern part of the county, south of the city, I should say, of downtown, there's an elevated train track that connects south of South Miami to downtown. And the pathway under that has been through a group of the Friends of the Underline, and the leadership of Meg Daly, who really championed and fought for this, and the county's Parks Department. They've really transformed this sort of, it was a path. There was a path there. It was not inspiring. It didn't feel exciting. I mean, I would have chosen to ride on US 1, which is the big, 6-lane highway, than that path. They have completely transformed it, but more than making it just a bike path and a pedestrian path, they have built. I think you see resilience on full display there. It's about alternative ways of commuting. I mean, that's, check. It's about places for people to gather and engage. They have weekly yoga, they have, farmers markets, they have tons of stuff happening there, and their numbers are really impressive, and they're seeing an uptick. And when we get to talk to them, I mean, they are constantly thinking of ways that they can improve that asset.
Mhm.
They're measuring through kind of showing resilience. They want to be able to. I think they're interested in being able to measure air quality and heat. I mean, that's I think one of our big climate issues
Yeah.
is heat. And so how can they use this kind of public right of way to help both improve the environment and make things more comfortable, but also to provide data. I mean, I think that's,
Yeah.
we know we have a lot of anecdotes, but I think when we talk about, being able to make real moves, I think being able to point at specific data. So the underline has been a really, I think, impressive way to build interest and it's kind of like you don't even know that it's necessarily that it's resilience or that it's ticking all these boxes, it's contributing to your health, but it somehow it all works. And that's really the goal,
That's
is to
the
make people want to
most,
go.
those are the most like, I mean, of course, I think like how they're like going about it is also very, educated and structured. But
Yeah.
sometimes, like to your point, you go into some communities and not knowing any of the fancy terminology or big words around things, they're like, okay, that is a circular economy right there. Oh, great. This is
Right.
generative. Like, this is like, and then you're kind of thinking, well, I mean, it's not that we did not have the knowledge. It's just that when we scaled into a new world, I guess with like industrial revolution, I don't know, maybe we need an historian, but we just like lost touch with how to sustain systems. And I think that's very fascinating how like I also always feel humbled when we go back and work with CBOs and things and you're like, well, we come in as the experts and we were talking with my partner the other day. We're like, well, we say community engagement as if we need to engage the community in, but actually it's more like we need to engage with the community so we learn, right? And I think
Yes.
that mindset shift needs to happen in design, planning, architecture space because we also, I don't know if we're recovering yet from an era where like, the star architect, the whatever, right? Like it's became
Right.
a branding or a cachet thing and it wasn't about the city or who's going to live in that building, but it was more about the designer. Um, but I'm hoping like I think we're moving away from that thing, like branded spaces a
Yeah.
little bit. Um, but in like not so, I mean, it's already here, right? But in short term too, we don't even have the luxury to think about branded spaces. We really, as all these like urgencies from everything you mentioned, from air quality to natural disasters that might happen that are the more visible consequences or like big threats around. Um, Basically not creating spaces for that are resilient and sustain. But I guess
Yeah.
to my question to you and for our listeners to have better knowledge in would be because what I find or see to be really paralyzing in these spaces are again the terminologies in a way, right? Like, so let's say we talk about climate change, we talk about all these big headers under that. Sometimes we deploy like principles, guidelines, policies, again, not necessarily accessible information, or if it is accessible, sometimes we don't understand how they translate into action, right? Or if we're doing some meaningful work in the space, there may not be in like KPIs identified to track how it has positively impacted. So
Right.
we sometimes miss the opportunity to create these benchmarks or further funding opportunities because we haven't tracked the success going back to your point in data, like collecting data. So what are some like if we were to translate the term resilience into what to track and what to look out for, how would you kind of break that down?
That's a really
Really
good
big.
question. It's really hard. I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about, how systems, that we haven't kept up, or systems have changed, and the way that we do things have changed. The one thing I was thinking is that, well, universities we talked about being siloed, but I think government was pretty siloed. And so I think the chief resilience officer to me really kind of created a more like lateral engagement for,
Mhm.
that role inherently has to be very interdisciplinary.
Right.
Like you have to have, and I think as planners we're kind of used to that. I mean, just through our like environmental review processes, we know we need fire sign off, we know we need,
Yeah.
air quality and parks and all of that. But I think that's such a narrow, that's sort of a small
Yeah.
wonky thing. I think when you have somebody who's at, an executive level in a municipality, or in a, in wherever they are, that, and I think it mirrors our feelings about the Climate Resilience Institute at UM, is that it does not work without everybody involved. It's, and that was the premise for the creation of that position, was to kind of like open up those lines of communication and really make things more effective. And for our institute, that was, that's been our primary goal, is really trying to show how connected, and things that, may not occur to people on the face of it, but that we have, people in the arts and sciences who are working with engineers, or who are, architects. I mean, there are some things that we know, engineers in the medical school, there's always been innovation around,
Mhm.
kind of instruments. But as we're moving into climate tech and new ways of kind of dealing with, our resilience issues and trying to make places more resilient, it takes a whole lot of new thinking, and I think new thinking, but also kind of rethinking
Right. Right.
the way we do things. Like, we talk so much about nature-based solutions, which is kind of like a back to the future in a way. It's like, we did the concrete seawalls. That's not great. We're kind of like going back to the early days of, what were the flora and fauna that were here, that actually, it turns out, have a lot of pretty cool capabilities. That we have these, incredible corals, and, has so much amazing research that's happening around corals, heat resistant, heat tolerant corals that are able to survive and thrive, and provide, protection from storm surge. So I think it's like an all hands on deck answer. I don't know. I don't,
I think it's like you
yeah,
have an underlying theme there, right? I think, like to your point, obviously in many big, especially city-related projects, a lot of different parties work together to get things done. But I don't think that necessarily means collaboration, right? Like when we look at the dictionary definition of collaboration, it's yes, like two plus parties coming together, but there's a shared
right.
goal. And is there a shared goal when we're trying to realize something in a city, or in a space? And I think, to your point, having kind of senior leadership that have that interdisciplinary exposure, and also who could like facilitate that collaboration, is a huge opportunity. And also, I guess, like, because it's so multifaceted and we don't even know what we don't know, maybe when we go into space, or to your point, like when we go into space, sometimes, well, actually, indigenous know-how and nature already had a handle on this. We
Right.
basically came in, undermined it, and like changed things, and then we were like, oh wait, this didn't work. Let's go back. Um,
Right.
so there is an opportunity to like reflect back on what has happened, but I think that again takes different levels of collaboration with diverse stakeholders. So um, I guess like what's interesting to see, and it's so interesting, like it's quite chronic when you look at any challenge in the world or in a city, the under like the when you recommend solutions, right? The methodology is quite similar. Or like, well, first when you look at the underlying issues, there are similarities, like, oh, there are silos, big one, right? Oh, there's
Right.
poor communication between stakeholders, that's another one, right? So there's like quite repetitive issues in all. And then you're thinking, okay, then what do we need to do to address that? And when we look at effective collaboration, that's kind of the way to bring everyone together. And I think it's interesting um, to have kind of like a dedicated space and platform to help achieve that. And I think that's what we found really cool about the Institute, right? Like it is, first of all, tying it to, I think, an academic setting is frees it from kind of, I guess, like business or more government like baggage, first of all, communities might have, or business like just profit mindset, right? It kind of creates this like third party realm where people can come together, and then you also become the facilitator of these conversations, which clearly we need much, much more of it. We still like,
Yeah.
you're like, oh my God, it's 2025. We still have lack of knowledge sharing in silos. Like, how does this happen? But
No, I think it's really like a rarefied. I agree. I mean, I think I've been really impressed with Miami, how the local governments here have really wanted the collaboration with the universities. That wasn't my feeling when I worked for the city of New York as much. It was, a little bit, and city of New York is exponentially bigger, has a very different profile, but it has been there have been true collaborations and things, the needle has been moving because of these on both sides. There are things that have happened in research and in academia
right,
because of this collaboration and being able to identify pinch points and kind of holes that they have, which then feed into our academic inquiry, and they really there it's a real partnership. I mean, there's a paper that was just published at UM that a number of our colleagues were working on, and it's called "Where the Heat Doesn't Come in Waves," and it has a longer
Mhm.
title. But it is, that was I think it's a very unique look at extreme heat. Like we've been talking about extreme heat in Miami for a while, and this particular paper looked at indoor temperatures. So looked at, they had a survey. I think they had maybe 60 sites, and they looked at the indoor temperatures, and the findings of that are directly should hopefully feed into public policy. I mean, that's where I think this connection is so important, that they found people who are living in apartments that got over 105 degrees inside. I mean, it was just, and there's so many reasons for it. I mean, it's, having, either they can't afford to pay for the air conditioning, or it's not usually that people don't have air conditioning. That's like a thing that I think people have
Right,
been
right, right.
pretty clear about, sort of, like people have it. It is really expensive to run it. And there's a lot of other factors, but I think having that kind of tangible data and being able to show that to a decision maker, I think that connection is so critical. And
Yeah.
I feel really fortunate to be able to be part of that, kind of those discussions, because I think it is, from my time working on sort of the policy side, it feels, I feel like I had a missing link, that I wasn't kind of as, hand in hand with academia. And it's certainly not universally applicable. It's not every discipline. It's not, but there are areas, I think, where things are changing, our knowledge, things are changing. Like the earth is hotter, like that is a
Yeah.
fact.
Yeah.
And what that means for people living here, the way that we live in the world is changing. And so, we're, I think, appropriately ahead of, or, hopefully that's the ideal, is that you're ahead of this in a way that you can make meaningful change before it gets too late.
Yeah. And to your point,
Yeah.
it calls for all of us, like, right, in terms of like, or is how we educate future planners, engineers, architects, designers, and having institutes like this that also help academia because, professors sometimes like they do their own research and the data they collect is very much for their research and more in like kind of like a
Mhm.
bubble. But these centers or institutes are kind of the spaces where it has the opportunity to have students get exposed to these multi-stakeholder collaborations too, which is in my mind, like now is like the most important thing any like young professional coming into the world should be well versed in and should understand they need to be doing, right? Like how do we
Yes.
um, uh, stay close to communities, like really not do out of touch work, and also
Yeah.
how do we effectively collaborate in a multidisciplinary context? And from like students to like educators, how do we address that? How do we talk about these things? In industry, how do we make these big things actionable in a way? And like to your point, it's sometimes, are the very small details that may not even like can be very low or no cost that are the details that can be addressed that promotes spaces. But how do we raise awareness in that within industry? And how do we drive policy change in government? And it's all tied in with
Yeah.
each other. So um, I think, I mean, we were very happy to, discover the Institute. I think it's important to highlight work and initiatives like this too, because I think, um, like in any like industry too, academia sometimes also stays within their own bubble or don't have the spaces to really achieve this collaboration, industry or within academia, even collaboration. So with that, and I think you had like some great nuggets, and when you were talking about the work underline, you mentioned, people recognize change is not gonna happen overnight, but you keep chipping away at it anyway. I think that was one of the great advice that I would take from this like episode too, because like I think like in any problem in the world today, right? There's no solving it right away, right? But what we could do is
Right.
address in different ways. And yeah, anything else that you would like to add? Um,
No, I just realized the whole when you asked, what would I want to title this episode, and what is my what is my problem? And it's so I mean, I I was thinking about my first impression of Miami, and kind of not to be like, and very cognizant of the like, well, in New York this would never happen,
yeah,
but I really did have when I first moved here, I really did have something that felt so shocking to me. It's not that not dark, but I was walking my son in his stroller on the sidewalk outside of where we moved to Miami, which is it's a suburban part of Miami, but it is walkable to some things. And that was a very, pragmatic choice of ours. But we were walking on a sidewalk and I came across a fire hydrant in the middle of the sidewalk. And it was so shocking to me. And I just like couldn't I mean, I just, it was obvious that the fire hydrant had been there and the sidewalk came second because this was a new development. But the idea that there's only one way through is just to build a sidewalk around it and cut a hole in the paving. And, I just, I've seen that again. I mean, it's not universal, but
yeah,
it really was like, I guess we're not in Kansas anymore. But it was like, it's things like that, I think this resilience, when we are talking about resilience, there's so much work, there's so much thought and so much innovation and invention, but the real resilience, kind of like day to day that everybody is involved in is just wherever you live. Do you say hi to your neighbor? You're building resilience. Like if something happens, God forbid, you would recognize if your neighbor's not answering the door. When we're walking the dogs, you see the other dog. I don't even know the owners. I know the dogs, but it's like
yeah,
that. I know, this sort of shared experience. And
yeah.
so the sidewalk, I think, feels like this kind of metaphor of livability that, that's what connects you to other people and connects you to getting to other places. And when you hit a roadblock, or as I've also seen happen here, because sidewalks are not required in a lot of places, is the sidewalk ends. And that was a really important book to me when I was a kid. I never thought I would see that happen, but it's just I think I feel very cognizant, and I think there's a growing, I think, sense of this, and there has been, but just that the places we live, we are building resilience the way that we live and the way that we're making thoughtful decisions. And, um, that fire hydrant was a real, I don't know, it just really stands out to me.
I love that. If you ever have a book, please name that, like the fire hydrant, and then that's the cover.
Right. If I ever got a tattoo, it would just be that fire hydrant. And
But I love
um,
that example. Like building relationships is also building resilience, right?
yeah,
Like I think what we were saying in terms of like how, like, what do I even do about this? How does this relate to me? I think so many things around resiliency is translates to our day to day. I think it's just
yes,
it's cool to reframe the things we do in our day to day, how we live, and how we build
yeah,
relationships in our building, our neighbors, our neighborhoods. I
right.
think it's cool. It's a cool reframe to think about these things to make it actionable and just like also more thoughtful, to your point, not only like action.
And it feels achievable. It feels like you're
Yeah.
actually, I mean, everybody's got some skin in the game, and I think generally it's like you walk out your door and you're part of a place. It's pretty great.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. This is so much fun. We
Oh, and this is
talk
great.
about
Thank you
many
so
things
much.
across many cities too, but
I
thanks for
don't,
taking the time and just
I'm
like,
sorry in advance for whatever you have to chop away or make this coherent.
no, I love that. I loved every bit of it. This is
Yeah.
great.
Oh, you're
Thank
so sweet. It
you.
was really fun. Thank you so much. It was great to meet you.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below. And don't forget to join us next week. See you.